Let's do this! Hello! Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's Jose here, welcoming you to the final part in the trilogy. Final opinion piece on what I consider would be good starting points for people looking to get a bit involved, for people looking to get a bit interested, to dive into fantasy fiction. Now, preparing for this video, doing the previous two recaps that I did on fantasy recommendations for beginners and stuff like that has given me a lot of food for thought, has made me reconsider and realize some gaps I've got in my reading of the fantasy genre. Now, I've decided to split this video into two parts. One, my recommendations for what I would consider maybe younger readers, maybe teenagers, maybe, just a generally younger audience. And then some recommendations for more adult, mature readers. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're in your 30s, maybe you've started your 40s like me, and you want to try something different. Now, I have to say, I came to a realization, so a word of warning. If you decide to get involved in fantasy, high fantasy in particular, at some point you are going to have to bite the bullet and get into very chunky, very lengthy book series. It's kind of inevitable. Epic fantasy comes in big chunks. Now, not everything has to be Lightbringer series, 5-book series. Not everything has to be an unfinished, what am I doing this backwards there? Not everything has to be A Song of Ice and Fire, unfinished stuff, and not everything has to be Realm of the Elderlings, what am I doing with my hands? 15-book series type thing. But you may have to get involved in a trilogy at some point in your life, because it looks like in fantasy reading, authors get paid by the page, not by the story. So if you're a person that balks at the involvement and the size of the volumes and stuff, maybe, sorry to say, perhaps fantasy really is not for you, or at least epic high fantasy. There are different subgenres there that I'm hoping to touch upon. So anyway, I'm going to start with my recommendations for younger readers. I would say, my opinion, correct me if I'm wrong, leave your comments please. I will start any young reader with The Hobbit. The Hobbit. It was the first book I got from my local library when my parents got fed up of buying books for me, children's books and stuff. It was costing them too much money. They got me a membership to my local library. I went across the river where I lived, and the first book I took out was The Hobbit, and I read it in one single sitting in one evening. It is really good. I think it's very appropriate, very age appropriate for anyone in the early teens. It's got all the elements there. Not so much for adults perhaps because of the tone of the book, but I think it's a really good entry point for younger readers. It's got dragons, elves, orcs, trolls, wizards, adventure. It is fantastic. The chapters are a manageable size, and it's got action. It's not overly complicated language. Really good entry point for any young reader. Next, and I think that maybe perhaps younger readers may not balk so much at this, I will go with Chronicles of the Dragonlance by Margaret Wise and Tracy Hickman. I'm a big fan of the Dragonlance series, if you follow the channel. I know it is a trilogy, but it is pure adrenaline. It is pure Dungeons and Dragons. It is pure fantasy, as fantastical as you can get. Gods, wizards, dragons, draconians, orcs, goblins, dwarves. It's got everything in there. Pace is fantastic, stakes are high, real adventure, real epic scope. What more could you possibly want? And I think I read them again as a teenager, and I've reread them many times as an adult. Really, really good, joyful fantasy ride. Awesome stuff. I think this is a bit of a forgotten classic. I don't see anyone talking about this. This was actually compulsory reading when I went to school. We read The Never-Ending Story. At school, and then I reread it a couple of times. Now, it's sort of a mix between urban fantasy and high fantasy. It's kind of, but it's a bit of a meta book. It's about a boy reading a book set in a fantasy world, but you are the person reading the story about the person reading the story. And I remember with amazement and with wonder when I realized that the cover of the book I was reading was the cover of the book that the boy was reading, and that the book was printed in two different colored letters to distinguish between the fantasy setting and the real world setting that the boy was living in. And the book you're reading is printed, and the book that the boy is reading is printed in those two same colors. So it's kind of like adventure within adventure type thing. So it's kind of a bit forgotten, no one talks about it, but really enjoyable. I'll admit, however, that the second half of the book lags a little bit, and it becomes a bit more weird, a bit more metaphysical. But certainly the first half of the book is a wonderful story. Again, a high fantasy world with really, really high stakes and poignant at times. So really, any young reader, I would really recommend it, with the caveat that perhaps the second half of the book may pull the overall experience down a bit, but I wanted to remember it and throw it. Next, I would recommend for young readers, and this is compulsory in a lot of British schools, is the first Harry Potter book. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or the Philosopher's Stone, depending on whether you are in the US or in Europe. They changed the title for reasons. Harry Potter, yeah, it's a long series, but yeah, incredible. It's an incredible world. It's an urban fantasy series. I mean, well, I'm not going to explain what Harry Potter is, but for a young reader, kids at school, I wish it wasn't compulsory reading at school. I wish kids could discover it without being forced to read it at school, isn't it? Sometimes all it takes is for us to be forced to do something for us not to like it. But there you go. And I will leave it there. I think I will leave it there for young readers. It's a 4-book recommendation. I thought about adding the Icewind Dale trilogy by R.A. Salvatore there on this saga of the Dark Elf. But fantasy setting wise, world wise, adventure wise, I think maybe it's just another Dungeons and Dragons trilogy. I'm not going to say it's the same or similar to Chronicles of the Dragonlance, but the path trodden is very similar. So, and I think between the two, Chronicles is a bit more epic, it's a bit more light-hearted, perhaps it's a bit more fantastical, and I would leave it there, but maybe Icewind Dale trilogy. Now, for more adult readers, I really struggled because the fantasy books I would actually recommend adults would be your long series that I've got here in my top shelf. What was my? There you go. Somewhere there and here. But I've tried to avoid doing that because I don't know. I cannot go to someone and go, "Here, did you want to enjoy fantasy? Bosh, read. You're gonna read these 3 books there, Night Angel trilogy." I don't want to do that to someone or go, "Oh, you know, really good fantasy series here, bam, the 4 Faithful and the Fallen volumes, chunk, here you go." That'll be daunting, and it would prompt that question: do I really have to do that to enjoy fantasy? To which the answer is, at some point you're gonna have to, if you really like fantasy. So, anyway, what could be single volume stories I could recommend people? First one If you watch the other videos, if you follow the channel, you probably can guess it. My number one recommendation for adults would be Lies of Locke Lamora. Now I know. Lies of Locke Lamora is book one of a series that is not even finished. It's about halfway there. Scott Lynch issues taking a long time to publish. But The Lies of Locke Lamora can be perfectly read as a standalone book. And the fantasy elements are low. Yes, there is wizards, but they don't feature much. There's no fantastical creatures. Actually, I would even struggle to classify it as a fantasy series. It's just, and I don't know what I would call it. It's almost like Ocean's 11 meets Game of Thrones. Type thing. Really, there is not a lot of fantasy at all, other than the action happens in some medieval time in some other world. But that's about it. There is no real magic to be spoken of. There's no fantastical creatures. There's no. It's a very sort of, all the action happens in a town, in a city. So there's no traveling to wonderful, amazing places or anything of the sort. But the character work, my friend, is incredible. That bromance between Jean and Locke is second to none, and the dialogue is super witty. Scott Lynch is a fantastic dialogue writer, and the supporting cast of characters, the twins, it is just a really good, heist novel. It's a heist novel set in some weird medieval world, but if you can overcome that, and I can see why not, because the world is very cleverly created to resemble Venice and Germany and stuff like that. It requires very little of the theatre of the mind, of the suspension of disbelief, to enjoy the novel. Now the risk is you enjoy it so much that you want to read the next few books and you're going to be waiting for a long time. But welcome to fantasy, epic fantasy world. Right, Lies of Locke Lamora. Then, for a completely change of a style and flavor, I would recommend American Gods by Neil Gaiman. This is a pure urban fantasy book. I did a review, check it out. If you haven't done so, I'm not going to talk about it here, but it's a completely different thing. It shows a completely different aspect of what fantasy writing can be about by a fantastic author that has got an incredible imagination in ways that are not your bog standard Dungeons and Dragons type thing, and it just takes familiar elements and crafts something utterly different and incredible and fantastical out of things that we are familiar with already. So yeah, American Gods would be my recommendation. Now, this is where I struggled. And this is where I realized I haven't read very many standalone fantasy books. So now comes the point where I may have to run the risk of recommending someone books I haven't read based on the fact that I know the author. So for instance, for a modern, mature reader, I could easily recommend the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. However, again, here you go, trilogy. How about pick one of these standalones set in the same First Law trilogy world, written by Joe Abercrombie, something like Best Served Cold. Now, I haven't read it, my hands up, but I know the author, I know the world, it's set in the same world, I know his character work, and his character work is fantastic. So it just shows what fantasy writing can be. It's not about fantastical world, it's also about fantastic characters. So maybe I'll say to someone, try this out. I haven't read it, but it's something that would definitely, me, myself, want to read and get into. And, having read a bit of fantasy, I can recommend that. And then, that's it. I cannot recommend standalones. I've realised that that's the gap in my reading culture knowledge. I don't know. I may have to bite the bullet and recommend a series to someone. And then I have to think, about the person who my target audience is, and recommending something. If you like really high fantasy stuff, I mean, I would recommend, for sentimental reasons, the Night Angel trilogy, because that's the trilogy that got me back into reading fantasy as an adult. Now I know it is not perfect. I know it's got its critics, but for an adult reader, and some of the themes and some of the scenes that it touches, I'll recommend it. Modern fantasy has got a lot less magic and a lot less fantasy than more traditional fantasy. But maybe if you want to bite the bullet, give it a go. Trilogy, you're putting on your spelunking gear and going to a big adventure, Night Angel trilogy. Or maybe perhaps I will consider the sensibility of the person that I'm dealing with, or their taste for adventure and stakes, and maybe I want to give them something a bit more, thinking, a bit less action. And so I would judge the character of the person. Now, are they looking for adventure? Are they looking for a different setting and explore the probabilities? And maybe I would say, perhaps controversially, the Life Ship Traders trilogy, the second trilogy in the realm of the Elderlings series by Robin Hobb. Now, I know that perhaps starting in the second trilogy may sound anathema to some people, but it can be read exceptionally well as a standalone. But it also allows you, if you like that world and you're going to get involved, you can go back to the first trilogy. There's no problem there. It's not going to affect you not reading them in order. And after you read the first and second, or second and first, then you can go into the third one and continue. But these first two trilogies are kind of interchangeable there. As more standalones, Tim Powers over down there is a fantastic urban fantasy author and writer of very low-key fantasy. He takes historical events and wraps them in a fantasy mystery type thing. And there perhaps I would recommend Anubis Gates, or The Last Call, or perhaps Declare. One of those three, nothing else. I did an author overview on Tim Powers. Again, an author that I've never seen in any of the lists I've reviewed for fantasy readers. So there you go. Now, these are my recommendations. These are my thoughts. I know they're not perfect. Perhaps they're not what people are expecting. But hey, that's me. And that's what I've got for today. Thank you ever so much for watching. Please, please, please like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you think. Thank you ever so much for my new subscribers. Count is going up. I was hoping to finish 2020 at 100, but hey, so far it's not even mid-January. I am at 94, so I'm hoping to do a shelf tour when I get to 100 at some point. So thank you ever so much. Spread the message, spread the love. Please, please, please take loads of care, and I'll see you next time. Bye.